What happens when 10 African countries say to the West at the same time, "We stop selling raw materials"? The map of Africa lights up. 10 countries are now red. Images of gold, uranium, coffee, stamped, banned export. Global shock. France loses uranium for nuclear power. The US lacks gold to stabilize its banks. Europe trembles because of lack of morning coffee. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré declared, "We set new rules of the game. If the world wants resources, it must accept Africa's true value." This is not a request for permission. This is a challenge. In December 2022, Reuters reported that Ghana ordered large mining companies to sell 20% of their refined gold to the central bank in a bid to shore up foreign reserves. In 2021, Uganda announced a ban on the export of unprocessed agricultural products, including coffee, to promote local industry. And in 2022, Namibia introduced restrictions on exporting unprocessed lithium, demanding foreign firms invest locally before taking resources abroad. These headlines are not isolated. From gold to cocoa, timber to uranium, a pattern is emerging. Africa is saying no. The night was heavy in Ouagadougou. The presidential palace, built in the era of French command, now echoed with new voices. Voices that spoke not of compliance, but of defiance. At the center of the chamber sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, flanked by ministers and generals. Maps were spread across the table, maps of mines, rivers, and border routes once charted for foreign benefit. Tonight, they were being redrawn for Africa. Traoré's voice was steady, almost whispering, yet it carried the weight of centuries. Why should the world's poorest be cursed to sit on the world's richest soil? Why must our gold build their banks while our people build shacks? No more. The room fell silent. In that silence, a decision was born. Not just to restrict exports, not just to follow Ghana or Uganda, but to lead, to make Burkina Faso the emblem of a new Africa. Outside, the streets were restless. Traders whispered about rising food prices, farmers worried about retaliation from foreign buyers, and elders remembered the coups and punishments of the past. Yet amidst the fear, there was pride. For the first time, the name of their country was not being spoken as dependent, but as defiant. Reports spread quickly. Uranium shipments halted at the border, trucks of raw gold redirected to local refineries. International corporations warned that the days of cheap extraction were over. Western ambassadors requested urgent meetings. They demanded explanations. They hinted at sanctions, but Traoré refused the language of apology. "Tell them," he said to his envoy, "that Africa will not ask permission to be free." And with that, a signal was sent across the continent. From Niamey to Kampala, from Accra to Kinshasa, leaders began to call Ouagadougou not as a follower, but as a beacon. The heart of the revolution was no longer in foreign capitals, it was in Burkina Faso, led by a man the West never expected, Ibrahim Traoré. In Paris, the boardroom of a major mining corporation buzzed with alarm. Overnight, their supply chains had been strangled. Contracts worth billions were now worthless papers, stamped with seals from Ouagadougou. Men in tailored suits spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling with disbelief. "How can a country with so little power bring us to our knees?" one director asked. But the truth was clear. The power was never in their hands, it had always lain beneath the African soil. Across the Atlantic, Washington was no calmer. Analysts laid out charts showing how Burkina Faso's decision to halt uranium exports would ripple into Europe's energy grid. Gold prices were already spiking, investors panicked, and whispers of nationalization spread across African capitals like wildfire. Still, inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was very different. In the rural villages where poverty had long been inherited like a curse, people gathered around radios, listening to every announcement from Ouagadougou. Farmers nodded with cautious approval. Market women spoke of sacrifice, but also of dignity. A teacher in Bobo Dioulasso told her students, "Children, remember this day. History is not written in books, it is written in courage." Meanwhile, Traoré convened his closest circle in a dimly lit war room. Charts of grain supplies, solar projects, and transport routes filled the walls. This was not just about blocking exports, it was about building an economy that could stand without foreign crutches. One general spoke anxiously, "Captain, sanctions will come. They will try to suffocate us." Traoré looked around the table, his young face hard as steel. "Then let them. Africa must learn to breathe on its own. If they close their doors, we will open our own. If they cut our lines, we will weave new ones. Sovereignty is never gifted, it is taken, and it is defended." The room erupted in quiet determination. What began as one man's defiance was quickly becoming a continental awakening. Burkina Faso was not just resisting the West, it was declaring that Africa would no longer be mined for free, no longer treated as a pawn, no longer silenced. The first sanctions came swiftly. Western banks froze Burkina Faso's reserves, choking access to international payments. Cargo ships carrying machinery and medicine were suddenly delayed. Foreign news outlets began broadcasting images of empty markets, framing the nation as a failed experiment. But Traoré had anticipated this. At a dawn meeting, he addressed his ministers. "They think we will starve. They think our people will rise against us. But we will not wait for handouts. We will build." Within weeks, Burkina Faso launched emergency programs. Community farms, supplied by military logistics, mobile clinics, staffed by volunteer doctors, and solar grids powering villages long forgotten by international aid. Instead of collapsing, the nation discovered a resilience it never knew it possessed. Meanwhile, across Africa, something extraordinary began. In Bamako, students marched with placards that read, "If Burkina rises, we rise." In Niamey, Nigerian soldiers saluted when Traoré's speeches were broadcast. In Accra and Lagos, fiery debates filled cafes and radio stations. Could Africa, for the first time in modern history, truly stand united against the chains of dependency? Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat in his modest office late into the night, a single lamp burning. Reports lay scattered before him: shortages, unrest, foreign threats. Yet also, signs of hope: local cooperatives forming, gold revenues redirected into infrastructure, neighboring states asking for talks. His aide entered quietly. "Captain, there are rumors. France and the United States are drafting plans for intervention. They call you reckless, dangerous." Traoré did not flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the maps of Africa pinned to the wall. Dangerous? Yes. Dangerous to a system built on our suffering. But tell them this: Africa is no longer a colony of anyone. If they come with weapons, we will resist. If they come with lies, we will speak the truth louder. Outside, in the streets of Ouagadougou, chants echoed through the night. Sovereignty or nothing. Africa must rise. It was no longer just Burkina Faso's struggle, it was the birth of a movement. A fire had been lit, and across the continent, millions were beginning to feel its heat. To understand why Traoré's words strike such a nerve, we must travel back through history, back to the foundations of Africa's relationship with the world. The age of plunder. For centuries, Africa was treated not as a continent of nations, but as a warehouse of resources. Gold from Mali fueled European treasuries. Ivory from Congo adorned royal courts. And, most tragically, millions of men, women, and children were taken from their homelands in chains, their bodies turned into commodities for global markets. This era of slavery and colonial plunder ripped entire societies apart. Wealth extracted from Africa financed the rise of Western powers, laying the foundations of their industrial revolutions. Meanwhile, African civilizations that once traded, built, and innovated were systematically weakened. The colonial carve-up. By the late 19th century, European powers gathered at the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where they drew borders across Africa with rulers and pens, slicing through cultures and kingdoms. These lines, arbitrary and foreign, remain largely unchanged today. Colonial governments imposed economies built on extraction. Cocoa in Ghana, coffee in Ethiopia, copper in Zambia, uranium in Niger, but here is the trap: they never designed these economies for African prosperity. They were designed for export. Infrastructure was built not to connect Africans to each other, but to funnel resources outward to the coasts, and then across oceans. Independence without freedom. The mid-20th century brought waves of independence. Flags changed, anthems were sung, leaders declared sovereignty. Yet, the structure of dependency remained. Economies were still tied to the price of raw materials in London, Paris, and New York. New governments inherited borders and economies they did not design, and which often worked against them. Worse, many African nations remained financially tethered to their former colonizers. France, for example, continued to exert control through the CFA franc, a currency still used today by 14 African countries, its reserves held in the French treasury. This meant that even after independence, many nations were not truly free in how they spent or invested their own wealth. The neo-colonial web. The 21st century did not end this dependence, it deepened it. Today, Africa supplies 80% of the world's platinum, 40% of its gold, 70% of its cobalt, and 30% of its uranium. Yet, African nations often receive only a fraction of the profits. Multinational corporations extract resources, sell them on global markets, and return little in taxes or local development. Even food dependency is a weapon. Africa, with its vast fertile lands, still imports over $40 billion of food annually, much of it from Europe and Asia. And when governments attempt reforms, whether nationalizing mines or redirecting revenues, sanctions, coups, and foreign meddling often follow. Why Traoré's stand matters. This is the weight of history pressing down on Ibrahim Traoré. His demand for sovereignty is not just about Burkina Faso, it is a rejection of centuries of exploitation. He is asking the unthinkable. What if Africa kept its own wealth? What if African nations traded with each other, built industries instead of exporting raw materials, and controlled their currencies instead of outsourcing them? Such questions terrify those who profit from the status quo. Because if Africa stood united and sovereign, the global order would shift. Burkina Faso may be small, but in challenging the old system, Traoré has placed his nation at the center of a storm that has been gathering for centuries. The sanctions meant to break Burkina Faso instead gave birth to a vision, an African economic order built not on dependency, but on sovereignty. In a televised address, Ibrahim Traoré declared with unflinching resolve, "For too long, Africa has been the warehouse of the world. Our gold, our cocoa, our oil stolen and sold back to us at 10 times the price. This is slavery by another name. Today, Burkina Faso says, no more." His words ignited debate from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. For decades, Africa had accepted its role as an exporter of raw wealth. Now, a young generation began asking, why should we remain trapped in this cycle? The new vision stood on 3 pillars: resource sovereignty, renegotiating every contract, forcing foreign firms into partnerships where Africa holds the majority; Pan-African industry, building factories to process cocoa, refine oil, and manufacture batteries and fertilizers on African soil; continental unity, forming a bloc powerful enough to resist outside pressure, from Niger's uranium to Ghana's cocoa. Critics in Washington and Paris dismissed it as populist rhetoric. But inside Africa, ordinary citizens whispered a word long buried: Renaissance. The whispers soon became reality. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed the Sahel Economic Pact, vowing that not a single gram of gold or uranium would leave their soil without African oversight. Then came the shock. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, the world's cocoa giants, joined in, banning raw exports until local factories could process them first. Across Ouagadougou, Accra, and Bamako, new plants began to rise, funded not by the IMF, but by pooled gold reserves and fresh partnerships with Asia and the Middle East. Western analysts scoffed, but when African-made chocolate appeared on supermarket shelves in Lagos and Johannesburg, it sent a thrill across the continent. At the heart of this movement stood the Pan-African Development Bank, an institution free of Western dictates, offering zero-interest loans to create jobs and secure food independence. Burkina Faso unveiled its flagship, the solar spine, 1,000 kilometers of solar farms lighting villages that had lived in darkness for centuries. This was more than economics. It was psychology. For the first time, Africans saw themselves as masters of their destiny. Children recited Traoré's speeches in classrooms, while workers marched beneath banners declaring, "Our resources, our future." But hope had its enemies. Old elites whispered in foreign embassies. Intelligence reports warned of covert plots, bribes, and destabilization. The real test was no longer whether Africa could build industries, but whether it could defend them. The turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the marketplace. One morning, headlines flashed across the world. Europe bans cocoa imports from Africa's new alliance, citing labor concerns. Within hours, cocoa prices collapsed. Factories in Accra and Abidjan faced sudden order cancellations. Shipping companies refused contracts. International banks froze lines of credit. It was a financial ambush, swift, silent, and devastating. For decades, Africa had feared the gunboats of empire. Now, the empire had learned to wage war through spreadsheets, sanctions, and disinformation. Western media painted Traoré and his allies as reckless strongmen leading their people into poverty. Editorials warned of an African collapse unless the continent returned to the stability of IMF-guided economics. But the real twist came from inside Africa itself. Traoré's intelligence service intercepted secret meetings between several West African presidents and European envoys. Cash payments, luxury gifts, and vague promises of military protection were exchanged for one thing: betrayal. The plan was to fracture the Sahel alliance before it could consolidate power. Mali would be lured with weapons, Ghana with loans, Côte d'Ivoire with promises of trade deals. When Traoré learned this, he faced his most dangerous enemy, yet not Europe, but the old African elite who had survived by serving Europe's interests. In a private council meeting, a heated debate erupted. Some ministers urged compromise. "We cannot fight both the West and our own brothers. Let us slow down." Others demanded defiance. "If we retreat now, the dream dies forever." Traoré remained silent for a long time, then spoke in his low, commanding voice. "This is not just about Burkina Faso. It is not even about Africa. It is about dignity. If we fall to fear, our children will live as slaves to foreign masters. If we rise, even if we are crushed, they will know we fought." Oh, the room fell quiet. For the first time, the ministers saw the burden of leadership not as a crown, but as a cross. Then came another twist, one the West had not foreseen. China, Russia, and Turkey, watching the drama unfold, quietly opened back channels. They offered trade guarantees, military support, and investment in exchange for a foothold in Africa's new order. It was a devil's bargain. Accepting it could secure Africa's independence from the West, but risked chaining it to new masters. Refusing it could leave the alliance isolated, vulnerable to collapse. Traoré faced the hardest decision of his life. Would he open Africa's gates to non-Western powers, hoping to play them against Europe and America? Or would he attempt something no African leader had ever dared, building an economy truly independent without reliance on any empire? The world watched in suspense. What Africa chose in that moment would decide not just its future, but the balance of power for the entire 21st century. The night was cool in Ouagadougou. On the Grand Boulevard, thousands of young people held candles, their faces glowing with the quiet fire of belief. In the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, not on a throne, not behind armored glass, but among the people, speaking with a voice that carried both gravity and hope. "Brothers and sisters," he declared, "we are no longer beggars in the world. We are the guardians of a treasure that does not lie beneath the ground alone, but within our hearts and minds. Our unity is our gold. Our dignity is our oil. Our sovereignty is the true diamond." The crowd erupted. In that moment, the capital was not just a city, it was the beating heart of a continent in rebirth. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, radios carried his words. From the villages of the Sahel to the skyscrapers of Johannesburg, Africans repeated the chant, "Africa, rise up." But Traoré's final words cut deeper than celebration. Our struggle is not against the West. It is not against any people. Our struggle is against dependency, against the chains of debt, against the lies that told us we could not govern ourselves. To the youth of Africa, I say this: the torch is in your hands. Do not let it fall. Silence followed, heavy and sacred. For a moment, the entire Sahel seemed to pause, and then, as if answering a call written in the wind, the crowd lifted their candles high. One by one, flames joined into a sea of light, stretching across the night sky like a constellation reborn. In Europe and America, analysts watched uneasily. Some dismissed it as rhetoric. Others recognized something more dangerous to their interests: belief, for they knew that once a people truly believe in their power, no army, no currency, no embargo can extinguish it. And so, history turned. Not with the clash of tanks, not with the stroke of treaties signed in foreign capitals, but with the quiet, unstoppable resolve of a people choosing dignity over despair. Years from now, children would ask their grandparents where they were when Africa first declared, not with words, but with action, that it would no longer be plundered. And the answer would be, "We were there. We lit the candles. We carried the dream forward." This is not merely Burkina Faso's story. It is the story of Africa's awakening. And perhaps it is also a reminder to the world: sovereignty is not granted. It is seized, lived, and defended.